You know, I think I forgot to get my clicker back there, so give me a minute. I know I plugged it in, but I didn't grab the clicker part. Thank you, dear. We are getting close again to the end of the book, 1 Samuel. This is our 33rd lesson in 1 Samuel. We're in chapter 29. It's a short chapter, only 11 verses. This is what I consider to be David's Exile Part 10. And this is just, rather than calling it a wilderness, it is just the place of Aphek. And we have watched David in exile within the land of Israel, and him being chased all over by Saul. But now we find him, of course, hidden among the Philistines. The Philistines, we know, are the enemies of Israel. In the previous chapter, it began with a view of the camp of the Philistines. They were gathering, and David was there in conflict. And that's what we dealt with. Our theme was kind of the conflict that was there with Achish as they gathered the Philistine army to battle. And of course, also we saw how that Achish chose David and his 600 men kind of to be his personal bodyguards. Then all of a sudden we're whisked away from the camp, and it's not really chronological because at the same time then we see the camp of Israel. And Saul has gotten word of the gathering armies of the Philistines, and he has become fearful of the coming battle, doesn't know what to do. So he seeks information from the Lord through the prophet, through the Urim, but nothing happens. God will not answer Saul. So what does Saul do? In the whole last chapter, we saw him going to the witch of Endor to seek counsel from the dead. That is very clearly an abomination. And it is an abomination that is added to the reason why Saul was both rejected as king and died in the battle that is upcoming. So now all of a sudden we move into chapter 29, and the narrative now whisks us back away from the Philistines, from the Israelis, and whisks us back suddenly into the camp of the Philistines. And that's where we're at. That's what's going to be happening tonight. And we'll learn something about the armies gathered, the parade of Philistines, the adversary among us, an angel of God. If you've already read this chapter, you know who the angel of God is. And then back to Ziklag. Let's start off with the armies gathered in verse 1, where it says, "Now the Philistines gathered together all their armies to Aphek, and the Israelites pitched by a fountain which is in Jezreel." The call, of course, and we're focusing on the Philistines, went out to all of their armies, all of the military-aged men, to come to this particular front to fight with the Israelis. In other words, all able bodies and all necessary supplies were going to be gathered to this region. Now, this is not the first time that the Philistines have gathered in Aphek. If you have recalled all the way back in almost the beginning of our lesson, we find a story that you might not remember the town or the region of Aphek, but you'll remember the story. In fact, it seems to be a much more famous story than here. And that story is back in chapter 4 and verse 1, where the Philistines gathered in this same location. Israel lost 4,000 men, and they lost the Ark of the Covenant. So that's where it was taken. Aphek is also noted in 1 Kings. There's a couple other places where it's noted, but in 1 Kings chapter 13 and verse 16, when Elisha has told Joash, who is the king of Israel, if you remember, to shoot an arrow out of the window. And he has promised that this was the arrow of the Lord's deliverance. and that he would literally beat the Syrians in Aphek. So a little bit more of a story about Aphek, and you find more familiar stories about that within the scriptures. But let's go back to the narrative, the current Aphek narrative. The Philistines had their military spread out over their whole region. Militaries weren't just in one spot around the king in their kingdom. They spread their armies around throughout their domain to protect their cities and their towns, primarily against any and all invading nations that were seeking to make an encroachment upon their land. They also, if you remember, had these groups that were organized into what we would call marauders. They were much smaller bands that would make quick hits into some areas. They would try to expand control into a region. They would steal supplies. They would also try to cause a lot of fear in the hearts of some of the other nations. Well, now the call has gone out for the fighting men. Both armies are now amassing their full power of their armies to wage war. The Philistines are on one side of the valley, and the Israelites are on the other side. It even lets you know that in Jezreel, it was an area which overlooked the valley, and there was a great supply of water there. Then we get a view of these gathering Philistine armies, and you'll see it in verse 2 of the parade of the Philistines. Most of us know, in fact, Pat and I got the pleasure of going back to Georgia when my son was graduating from his special ops training. And it was really kind of neat to see all of the different groups parading by, and they're doing their cadence, and we could hear them from off in a distance with their calls that they were making as they were marching. And then to see them come up, it was quite impressive to see that display. And so here it's similar to something of that nature, except even greater than that, where it says in verse 2, "And the lords of the Philistines passed on by hundreds and by thousands." So they're orderly, they're organized, and they're collecting. And so here they are. While Saul is faithful and seeking the counsel of a witch, the Philistines are amassing and parading these troops. They're getting themselves organized. And really one of the things that they would always do with this too is they're getting their army hyped up. That's exactly what they were doing there. They would be there, they're cheering, they're getting excited. They were doing all of those things to hype their army up for it. And even the noise of the shouts, they were encouraging to their troops, but that noise of the shout of their troops was also causing panic in whoever they were fighting in their enemy. So it's a military procession. Maybe we could call it a dress parade of the troops. But there is one among them that does not belong. And the leaders of the Philistine armies take notice of this. And they said it right there, "But David and his men passed on in the rearward with Achish." So instead of the king being in the front, you can see that they're in the back. And who is exactly, if you remember, I told you David was chosen to be that personal bodyguard of the king. So he had David's men, those 600 men and David, surrounding Achish. And all these Philistines saw this. That's why we go on and we talk about this of being the adversary among us. Not among us here, but of course the adversary among the Philistines. And as much as this shows, you're going to see an adversarial relationship advanced rather rapidly. Immediately upon seeing David and his men being included as part of their army to go fight against Israel, the military leaders of these armies, or what they call the princes of the Philistines, raised an objection through a question. Look at the question that they asked. Then said the princes of the Philistines, "What do these Hebrews here? We're amassing an army to go fight against the Hebrews. Why are these Hebrews in amongst us? And Achish said unto the princes of the Philistines, Is not this David, the servant of Saul, the king of Israel, which hath been with me these days, or these years, and I have found no fault in him since he fell unto me this day? Now, when you start reading that, Achish, we know, had accepted David's argument, really, which was built upon David's false reports and his gifts that he was bringing to Achish, which bought Achish's approval and exactly what he said. In fact, it's interesting that some people will talk about how that David was loyal to Achish. I don't think so. He was pretending to be loyal. He put on a show of loyalty. David had convinced Achish of his loyalty, but while that impresses Achish, none of it impresses the princes of the Philistines. Little does David know that God's hand is literally moving upon the hearts of his enemy to do his will and cause David to be rejected of this army so that he will not have to go against the nation of Israel. What we see is that his servant was in a trap, really, that he had placed there for himself. The trap began when he put himself in a state of despair, when he saw no hope, when he was trying to escape Saul. David, at least from this record, we did not find him praying. We did not find him seeking God's counsel. He just said, you know what, I'm going to die, so I need to go to the Philistines and go hide from Saul. So I and my men, people will give David such a romantic view of how he was so honorable in protecting his men. No, he did not have any hope. He didn't have any trust in God. In practical application, we ought to see that the problems of the saint will always multiply when we do not trust in the protective hand of God. Think about it. But we will also see how God's providential hand is protecting David and his men from something far worse. You have to take into consideration the next chapter. And if you keep that in view, there's a little bit more involved. David was moving closer to home, closer to the throne, I should say, closer to his appointment as king of Israel. Despite the Philistine king's explanation and praise heaped upon David, it does not settle well with the princes of Philistine. In fact, they get mad at their own king. Verse 4, and the princes of the Philistines were wroth with him, not David, but with their own king. And the princes of the Philistines said to him, Make this fellow return, that he may go again to his place, which thou hast appointed him. In other words, make him go back to Ziklag, and let him not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he be an adversary to us. For wherewith should he reconcile himself unto his master? Should it not be with the heads of these men? In other words, they're saying logic precludes us adding David to our army. They really did give sound reasons why David and his men should not go to war with them against what they knew was their own countrymen. Now remember, Achish is convinced that David is now hated by his people. But in fact, that's not at all true. But the princes say he cannot be trusted. They're saying that they will turn against us. We get into the middle of the battle, we get into the fight, and right here in the middle of our army, we're going to be fighting another 600 men. So we'll have our attention that we have to pay attention to them and probably fight against them at Jezreel. They had no desire to insert potential traitors in the middle of their own armies. So again, make these Hebrews go back to the town you gave them. The next verse, verse 5, is going to reveal how information travels through the country without the web, without phones, without the internet, without text messaging, without Twitter, without Instagram. You know, we like the fact that all these things we can instantaneously get the news or get information. Listen, they didn't need any of it, and they still got the information. Look at verse 5, what it said. They said this, "Is not this David?" Now, Achish said the same thing, but they give it a little different flavor. "Is not this David, of whom they sang one to another in dances, saying, Saul slew his thousands and David his 10,000s. This is the exact message that Saul heard that got him so mad and infuriated at David that he didn't want to have him around. And these princes of the Philistines heard the same song and the same thing. And notice too, it's not just whom they sang, but they sang to one another in dances. They said in celebration. Listen, what does it tell you? It tells you that information passes quickly through this. Remember when Israel had come against Jericho? We find out that Ruth had heard about the Jews in their travels through the wilderness. They had heard about the victories, and she had heard about their faith in Jehovah and what he had done and how he fought for them. Even Jericho heard the news. So after the armies had gathered, after they were organized, after the hype is all up and they're ready for the battle, Achish has a problem. But his problem becomes David's deliverance. It's interesting that the armies didn't seek David's death, just get him out of here. God will always deliver us. Listen, even the Hebrew children, the three, when they had the threat of the king that was against them, if you remember, they said, we're not worried about answering you. God will deliver us. He'll either deliver us from your hands through death or through a liberty. But he will deliver us. And that's the same thing for us. And then this is where we see the heading, the angel of God or an angel of God. And you'll see who is called that in just a little bit. While Achish doesn't agree with his military leaders, he does submit to their vote because he knows otherwise it will cause a rebellion or at least a loss of excitement for his armies. But Achish's opinion of David is a very interesting one. Verse 6, Then Achish called David and said unto him, Surely as the Lord liveth, thou hast been upright. And thy going out and thy coming in with me in the host is good in my sight, for I have not found evil in thee since the day of thy coming unto me this day. Nevertheless, the Lord's favor thee not. In other words, David, you've been doing great. He bought all the news that David was bringing him. And remember, David was not allowing one soul to stay alive so that no one could report back what David was actually doing. I read one commentator that, hey, he was fighting a common enemy against the Philistines. So no, he wasn't. He was killing anybody and everybody and making that encroachment. But he wasn't really going against the Philistines at that time. At least this is an honest opinion of David, but it's an opinion that came because David had tricked the king. But it's the lords, the princes of the Philistines who don't favor him. But he's kind of telling him, go home without any shame or guilt. Don't worry about leaving the battle. Verse 7, Wherefore now return and go in peace, that thou displease not the Lord of the Philistines. And David said unto Achish, But what have I done? I almost can get a little smirk on David's face as he's looking back to some of his men, and he's saying, but what have I done? And what hast thou found in thy servant so long as I have been with thee unto this day, that I may not go fight against the enemies of my lord the king? He's still playing it up. But does David really want to go fight against Israel? No, he doesn't. Now, here's where that analysis of David comes in and why we've got that title. And Achish answered and said to David, I know that thou art good in my sight as an angel of God. Wow. David, you got this guy bamboozled. I kind of have a feeling that the Philistines, the princes of the Philistines, know that David's got you bamboozled. Notwithstanding, he says, the princes of the Philistines have said, he shall not go up with us to the battle. Remember, they got mad at him. They were upset. Verse 10. Wherefore now, and this is Achish to David, rise up early in the morning with thy master's servants that are come with thee, and as soon as ye be up early in the morning and have light, depart. The Philistines, the enemy of Israel, sends David and his men on a journey that will cause them to encounter another enemy. You'll read it in the next chapter when they get back to Ziklag that the Amalekites have taken his home city. Now, all that I've mentioned just right there is unknown to David. So David is told to go home. So in verse 11 we read, whoops, where's verse 11? I didn't have it up there. Oh no. It's supposed to be back to Ziklag. Maybe it'll pop up after my Psalm verse, but I'm going to read it this way. It's supposed to have the heading back to Ziklag. And verse 11 says, so David and his men rose up early to depart in the morning to return into the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. They went up to fight, to engage Israel. Now, I won't get into all that happens in the next chapter, in chapter 30, and find out, because it's not a very welcome sight. If you notice, too, I have called it home. David went home. I've said that a couple different times. But the text, which you don't see up there, it doesn't call it home. It just says David went back to Ziklag. Departed back to the land of the Philistines. That's where he went, back to the land of the Philistines. Imagine the burden lifted from the hearts and shoulders of these men. Imagine that I'm sure that David was concerned about what's going to happen. How are we going to get out of this mess? Are we going to end up fighting against these Philistines as they go up against Israel? Are we going to attack them in the middle and all die because of this? Imagine that now they're feeling, they are understanding they're not going to get caught in the fight. So as they're heading for home, the burden is lifted there. Really, burden is a lot lighter. They are not going to be called upon to raise the sword against their brothers. The burden has been lifted and their focus is now on home and family. But what they find catches them completely unaware. David finds himself in trouble again. So while he has the hand of God delivering from him from one problem, he encounters another problem, but even that problem, God will deliver him from that. But that's in the next chapter. There really are some great lessons to be learned from David's exile all through it. But here there are times we can see that David is restless, while at other times he is rested. There are times when he is restless, and there's times when he is patiently waiting on the Lord. In fact, many of David's psalms are songs of encouragement to us, to Israel, to wait on the Lord. They are reflective lessons. They are reflective lessons from a man who sees his faults, learns from them, and teaches others lessons from his failures. Wait, I say, on the Lord. That's why in Psalm 37 and 34, and there's plenty of them in there, but he says, wait on the Lord and keep his way, and he shall exalt thee to inherit the land. When the wicked are cut off, thou shalt see it. The key here is wait in obedience. That is the way of the greatest prophet. Wait for God's exaltation. Wait for his timing. I had a friend long ago, and I won't name him, in the ministry, who told me that I needed to learn how to toot my own horn. In other words, I needed to learn how to promote myself. He was quite a self-promoter. I told him that I would not be doing that I would leave the horn tooting to the Lord. If God wants to promote me, that's his business. I'll do his work. I'll be obedient, but I'm not going to toot my horn. I'm not going to promote Bill Brown. If you've ever noticed, I don't have a lot of things with my name being promoted out here. It's Carmichael Baptist Church, and it's the Lord, not Bill Brown, not Pastor Bill. David knows full well that promotion comes from the Lord. In Psalm 75, verses 6 and 7, he says, for promotion cometh neither from the east, nor from the west, nor from the south. Doesn't mention the north. But he does say this, but God is the judge. He putteth down one and setteth up another. David needed to remember his calling and his anointing to be king. His time of exile is almost over. And we will see his elevation to the throne very shortly. I pray that's been a blessing to you tonight. It was a short chapter, but to me full of good lessons, good learning, and something that we can all profit from. You know, any time that the Lord chastens us, we get off track, the Lord will not demolish us. He will not destroy us because we get in the wrong lane or because we get going to the wrong destination. God's protection will always be there. But we do need to remember that as much as God will protect us, the journey through which we will travel is not always going to be all that joyful. And you see that with David. There has to be a lot of concern on his part. And it's not going to be over because he gets back to Ziklag and they get back to where they think their families are.